Madison Clark's body hit the cafeteria trash can with a sickening thud that silenced 400 students mid-conversation. Leftover pizza sauce splattered across her white sweater like evidence of humiliation, the metallic clang echoing through Jefferson High's pristine dining hall like a death knell. But what happened in the next 8 seconds would end Tyler Richardson's reign of terror forever and create the most viral high school video in internet history. Because Madison wasn't just any exchange student, and Tyler Richardson, star quarterback, mayor's son, untouchable golden boy, had just made the biggest mistake of his privileged life. What nobody knew, including the 47 phones now recording, was that Madison Clark had a secret that would flip Jefferson High's entire power structure upside down. Every student watching knew they were witnessing something that would change everything, something that would make them question every assumption they'd ever made about strength, about power, about what happens when the underestimated finally fight back. The silence stretched like a wire about to snap, 400 teenagers holding their collective breath as Madison Clark slowly, deliberately, pushed herself up from the garbage that had become her throne. But let's start from the beginning, because the real story began 3 weeks earlier, when Madison first walked through Jefferson High's towering glass doors, carrying nothing but a worn canvas backpack and the kind of quiet confidence that made people look twice. Madison Clark had arrived from Billings, Montana on a gray September Monday. Her father's sudden job transfer with the Department of Agriculture forcing their family to uproot from everything familiar. At 17, she possessed the kind of understated presence that teachers appreciated and students initially ignored until they heard her speak. Her thick Montana accent marked her as definitively other in a school where regional differences were viewed as weakness, where conformity was currency and standing out meant standing alone. She'd chosen her clothes carefully that first day: faded jeans, practical sneakers, and a simple navy hoodie that concealed the kind of muscle definition that came from 6 years of competitive wrestling. Because that's what Madison Clark was hiding beneath her transfer student facade. She was a 2-time state finalist who'd placed 3rd at nationals the previous year. Her shoulders carried the memory of countless takedowns. Her hands held the knowledge of leverage and pressure points that could drop opponents twice her size. But Jefferson High operated by different rules than the rural Montana schools where Madison had earned her reputation. Here, in suburban Connecticut's wealthiest district, success was measured by social media followers and family net worth rather than individual achievement. The hallways gleamed with fresh paint and privilege, lockers that cost more than most cars back home, parking lots filled with graduation gifts that Madison's family couldn't afford in a lifetime. The school's social hierarchy was as rigid as it was ruthless. Athletes occupied the apex, particularly football players who carried the hopes of a community obsessed with Friday night lights. Below them came the academically gifted, whose parents donated generously to ensure their children's access to Ivy League connections. Everyone else existed in carefully maintained strata of relevance, from drama kids to debate team members to the invisible masses who simply tried to survive until graduation. And then there were the outsiders, the scholarship students, the transfers, the kids whose clothes came from discount stores rather than boutiques. Madison fell squarely into this category, her second-hand everything marking her as fair game for the kind of sophisticated cruelty that private school privilege bred like a virus. Tyler Richardson noticed her immediately, not because she was particularly striking, though she was, but because something about her presence felt wrong. Too controlled, too observant, like she was studying them as much as they were studying her. During her first week, Madison had remained strategically invisible, sitting alone during lunch, walking quickly between classes, avoiding the common areas where social hierarchies were established and maintained through daily ritual humiliation. Tyler Richardson stood 6 feet 2 inches of carefully cultivated perfection, sandy blonde hair that never seemed out of place, blue eyes that sparkled with the kind of cruel intelligence that money protected, and a smile that had charmed teachers into overlooking increasingly problematic behavior for years. As Jefferson High's starting quarterback, he carried not just the team's hopes, but the entire community's identity on his broad shoulders. His father, Mayor Harrison Richardson, had built a political career on family values and educational excellence. His mother chaired the school board while managing her successful real estate empire. But Tyler's perfection was performance, a carefully constructed facade that concealed growing desperation as college recruitment pressures mounted. Harvard had expressed interest contingent on maintaining his 4.0 GPA and demonstrating continued community leadership. What they didn't know, what nobody could know, was that Tyler's community service hours were fabricated. His charitable work existed only on paper, and his academic success depended on a network of intimidation that ensured weaker students completed his assignments rather than risk his wrath. The system worked because everyone understood their role. Teachers looked the other way because the Richardson family's donations funded their programs. Administrators avoided investigations because Tyler's father controlled their budgets. And students remained silent because crossing Tyler meant social suicide and sometimes physical consequences that mysteriously went unreported. Madison's arrival threatened this delicate ecosystem, not because she'd done anything overtly challenging, but because she carried herself like someone who didn't automatically defer to established power structures. When Tyler smiled at her in the hallway, she nodded politely but didn't light up with the desperate gratitude he expected from outsiders, grateful for his attention. When his friends made jokes at her expense within earshot, she didn't blush or hurry away. Instead, she observed them with the kind of analytical focus that made predators nervous. By her second week, Madison had become a problem that required solving. Tyler's first move came during lunch period on a Wednesday, carefully orchestrated and precisely timed for maximum impact. He'd positioned his girlfriend, Sophia Martinez, at a strategic table with her phone ready. His best friend, Jake Morrison, had cleared nearby seats to ensure optimal sight lines. And Tyler himself had practiced the approach until it looked spontaneous. Madison sat alone at her usual corner table, calculus homework spread before her like a shield against social interaction. She'd learned to eat quickly and efficiently, finishing her brown bag lunch while completing assignments that other students paid tutors to explain. Her concentration was absolute, pen moving steadily across worksheets that would determine her placement in advanced mathematics next semester. Tyler approached from her blind side, his movements casual and confident, as he carried a large cherry Coke purchased specifically for this performance. His friends watched with anticipatory grins, phones discreetly positioned to capture what they assumed would be another easy victory against someone too powerless to retaliate. The plan was simple: spill the drink across Madison's homework, offer a fake apology while secretly filming her distress, then post the footage with captions about clumsy exchange students who couldn't handle American academic pressure. "Oh, man, I'm so sorry," Tyler said as he deliberately tipped the 20-ounce drink across Madison's carefully organized papers. Cherry-flavored liquid cascaded over calculus problems like acid-dissolving dreams, equations bleeding into illegible messes that represented hours of work destroyed in seconds. "I totally didn't see you there." Madison's reaction wasn't what anyone expected. Instead of tears or anger, or the satisfying desperation that usually followed Tyler's attacks, She simply observed the spreading damage with analytical detachment. Her green eyes, the color of Montana prairie grass, studied the ruined homework like she was processing evidence rather than mourning loss. Then she looked up at Tyler with an expression that made several nearby students shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Thank you," Madison said quietly, her Montana accent somehow less pronounced, more controlled. "Some things can't be washed away." Her words carried weight that Tyler couldn't decipher, a meaning that felt like threat disguised as gratitude. She methodically salvaged what papers remained readable, movements precise and economical, like she was following established protocol for disaster management. Tyler's confident smirk wavered as Madison stood, her height bringing them nearly eye to eye despite his athletic advantage. "I said I was sorry," he repeated, expecting submission, receiving evaluation instead. "Accidents happen, right?" "They do," Madison agreed, her voice carrying implications that made Tyler's stomach clench unexpectedly. "But patterns aren't accidents. Are they, Tyler?" The use of his name, spoken with such casual familiarity, sent warning signals through his nervous system that he couldn't explain. How did she know him well enough to sound so certain about his patterns? Madison gathered her salvaged homework and walked away, leaving Tyler surrounded by witnesses to what felt suspiciously like defeat, disguised as victory. His friends clustered around him, voices artificially enthusiastic as they praised his performance. But their eyes carried questions Tyler couldn't answer. Why hadn't she cried? Why had she thanked him? And most disturbing, why did it feel like she'd been expecting his attack? Jake Morrison leaned close as they watched Madison disappear into the hallway crowds. "Dude," he whispered, his voice carrying the kind of fear that infected groups when their leader showed uncertainty. "She knew. She freaking knew you were going to do that." Tyler's blood turned to ice water, because if Madison had anticipated his move, that meant she'd been watching him, studying his methods, learning his patterns, preparing for conflicts he thought would catch her defenseless. And if she'd been watching him, she might have seen what happened last Friday night, the thing that could destroy everything he'd built, everything his family represented, everything his future depended on maintaining secret. The revelation hit Tyler like physical impact, his carefully controlled world suddenly feeling less stable than he'd believed. Because last Friday night, Tyler Richardson had made a mistake that went far beyond high school bullying. He'd been involved in something that crossed legal lines, something that could end his Harvard dreams, destroy his father's political career, and land him in juvenile detention if the wrong person learned the truth. Madison Clark was becoming more than an inconvenience. She was becoming a threat to his survival. And Tyler Richardson had learned early that threats required elimination before they became exposure. Over the next 48 hours, Madison conducted her own investigation with the methodical precision of someone trained to gather intelligence. She'd positioned herself strategically during Tyler's phone conversations, close enough to overhear fragments that painted a disturbing picture of desperation disguised as privilege. She'd observed his interactions with teachers, noting how his charm turned mechanical when he needed favors. Most importantly, she'd documented his treatment of other vulnerable students, recognizing patterns that suggested systematic rather than random cruelty. What she discovered made her stomach turn with familiar rage, the same fury she'd felt watching bullies terrorize smaller kids back in Montana. The same helpless anger that had driven her to wrestling in the first place. Tyler Richardson wasn't just mean, he was dangerous. And the system that should have protected his victims was instead protecting him. Madison's research revealed that Tyler's community service hours, supposedly earned through volunteer work at local charities, were completely fabricated. His mother had made donations to organizations that provided false documentation in exchange for financial support. His academic achievements depended on a network of intimidated students who completed assignments under threat of social destruction or worse. Most disturbing, his clean disciplinary record existed because complaints mysteriously disappeared before reaching official channels, buried by administrators who valued donations more than student safety. But Madison also discovered something else, something that explained Tyler's increasing desperation and gave her leverage she hadn't expected. Tyler Richardson was living on borrowed time, his perfect facade beginning to crack under pressures that money couldn't solve indefinitely. Thursday morning brought news that changed everything. Principal Davidson's announcement that Harvard University would be conducting surprise interviews with their top candidates the following week. Academic credentials would be verified, community service documented, and character references contacted for detailed testimonials. Tyler's fraudulent achievements would be exposed under genuine scrutiny. His future destroyed by the very investigation he'd always believed his privilege would prevent. Madison watched Tyler's face during the announcement, saw genuine panic flicker behind his practiced confidence. His hands trembled slightly as he processed implications he couldn't escape. His breathing became shallow as the weight of inevitable exposure settled over him like a burial shroud. For the first time since arriving at Jefferson High, Madison saw Tyler Richardson looking vulnerable rather than predatory. But desperation made Tyler more dangerous rather than less. Like a cornered animal whose survival instincts overwhelmed rational thinking. If Harvard's investigation would expose his fraud anyway, then his only hope lay in eliminating anyone who might provide damaging testimony before investigators arrived. Madison Clark had observed too much, questioned too openly, positioned herself too close to secrets that could destroy him. Tyler's final plan was supposed to be foolproof, a public humiliation so devastating that Madison would transfer schools rather than endure continued psychological torture. He'd learned from experience that victims who suffered total social destruction usually fled rather than fought, disappearing before they could become ongoing threats to his security. The method he chose was calculated for maximum impact. The cafeteria during peak lunch period, when 400 students would witness Madison's destruction. Tyler had positioned his crew strategically throughout the dining hall, phones ready to capture and broadcast her humiliation across every social media platform Jefferson High students used to establish and maintain social hierarchies. Jake Morrison occupied a table near the trash cans, his angle perfect for filming the incident Tyler had planned down to the second. Sophia Martinez sat with the popular girls, her followers eager to share content that would generate views and comments. Other athletes spread throughout the cafeteria, their presence ensuring that potential defenders would think twice before intervening on behalf of someone marked for destruction. Tyler himself waited until Madison was isolated, her usual corner table positioning her perfectly for his approach. She sat alone as always, brown bag lunch half finished while she worked on homework assignments that other students paid tutors to complete. Her concentration seemed absolute, pen moving steadily across worksheets like she hadn't noticed the gradually increasing tension surrounding her position. But Madison had noticed everything: the strategic positioning of Tyler's allies, the subtle shift in cafeteria energy that preceded coordinated attacks, the way conversations gradually quieted as students sensed approaching drama. Her wrestling training had taught her to read environments like tactical maps, identifying threats, escape routes, and advantages before opponents realized conflict was imminent. What Tyler Richardson didn't understand was that Madison Clark had been preparing for this moment since her first day at Jefferson High. She'd studied his methods, documented his patterns, and most importantly, she'd discovered information that could destroy him more thoroughly than he could ever destroy her. As Tyler approached her table with predatory confidence, as 400 students held their breath in anticipation of witnessed cruelty, as 47 phones positioned themselves to record another victim's destruction, Madison Clark made a decision that would change everything. She was done being hunted. It was time to become the hunter. Tyler's hands reached for her shoulders, his fingers making contact with fabric that concealed muscle developed through years of competition. His plan was simple: push her toward the trash cans with enough force to ensure humiliating impact. Film her distress and confusion. Then post footage that would make her social position at Jefferson High impossible to maintain. But as Tyler's weight shifted forward, as his balance committed to the attack, as Madison Clark felt his hands attempting to move her body against her will, something fundamental changed in the cafeteria's atmosphere. The air itself seemed to thicken with potential energy, like lightning gathering before it strikes. Madison's response was instantaneous and devastating. 6 years of wrestling training compressed into movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. Her body shifted with practiced precision. Her stance widened automatically as muscle memory took control. Tyler's push, intended to drive her helplessly toward humiliation, instead met resistance that felt like striking a mountain. The silence that followed was absolute. 400 students frozen in collective shock as they processed what their eyes couldn't quite believe. Tyler Richardson, Jefferson High's untouchable golden boy, stood over Madison Clark with his hands still extended, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and the first stirrings of genuine fear, because Madison Clark hadn't moved. Despite Tyler's athletic advantage, despite his leverage and surprise, despite every assumption about power and dominance that governed Jefferson High's social ecosystem, Madison Clark stood exactly where she'd chosen to stand, immovable as granite, unshakable as truth. And in that moment of crystalline silence, as phones continued recording and witnesses held their breath, as Tyler Richardson's perfect world began its inevitable collapse, Madison Clark smiled with the kind of controlled anticipation that promised education was about to begin. "You want to know what real strength looks like?" Madison asked, her Montana accent suddenly sounding less like a weakness and more like a promise. The question hung in the cafeteria air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Tyler's hands still extended toward shoulders that had refused to yield despite every law of physics he understood. Tyler's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his brain struggling to process how a girl 50 pounds lighter had absorbed his full-force push without moving so much as an inch. Around them, 400 students leaned forward in their seats, phones trembling in hands that had expected to capture routine humiliation, but were instead recording something unprecedented in Jefferson High's carefully ordered hierarchy. "I asked you a question, Tyler," Madison continued, her voice carrying across the silent cafeteria with surgical precision. She took one deliberate step forward, her movement fluid and controlled in a way that made several athletes unconsciously shift backward. "Do you want to know what real strength looks like?" Tyler's blue eyes flickered with the first genuine fear he'd experienced since elementary school, when playground bullies had targeted him before his growth spurt and his father's money had made him untouchable. But this wasn't fear of physical harm. This was something deeper and more primal. The fear of exposure, of having his carefully constructed identity stripped away in front of everyone who mattered. "You're crazy," Tyler whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. His hands dropped to his sides as Madison took another step forward. Her green eyes locked onto his with the kind of focused intensity that made prey animals freeze when predators finally revealed themselves. Madison smiled, not with cruelty, but with the satisfied recognition of someone whose patience had finally been rewarded. "Six-time Montana State Wrestling finalist," she said conversationally, as if discussing weekend plans rather than delivering Tyler Richardson's death sentence. "Two-time regional champion, third place at Nationals last year in the 130-pound division." The cafeteria erupted in whispers, a buzz of shocked recognition, as students processed information that recontextualized everything they thought they knew about the quiet transfer student. Madison Clark wasn't just some random outsider who'd stumbled into their world. She was an elite athlete whose credentials made Jefferson High's wrestlers look like amateurs playing dress-up. "That's impossible," Jake Morrison called out from his position near the trash cans, his phone still recording but his voice uncertain. "Girls don't wrestle at that level." Madison's laugh was sharp and genuine, the sound cutting through cafeteria noise like a blade through silk. "Tell that to the 47 boys I pinned last season," she replied, her gaze never leaving Tyler's increasingly pale face. "Including 3 who went on to win state championships in their respective weight classes." Tyler tried to step backward, his body's survival instincts finally overriding his ego's demands for dominance. But Madison moved with him, matching his retreat step for step like they were dancing to music only she could hear. Her posture had changed completely. Gone was the hunched defensiveness of a transfer student trying to avoid attention. In its place stood something controlled and dangerous. A predator who'd finished studying her prey and was ready to demonstrate exactly why she'd never been the victim Tyler had assumed. "Here's what's going to happen," Madison said, her voice carrying the kind of calm certainty that made smart people listen carefully. "You're going to apologize to me in front of everyone here. You're going to apologize to every student you've terrorized over the past 3 years. And then you're going to walk yourself to Principal Davidson's office and confess to the academic fraud that's been keeping you eligible for Harvard." The silence that followed was so complete that students could hear their own heartbeats. 400 teenagers holding their collective breath as they witnessed the impossible. Someone was threatening Tyler Richardson, not just threatening him, but doing it with the kind of confident authority that suggested she had the power to follow through on every word. Tyler's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a mottled purple that clashed with his designer polo shirt. "You can't prove anything," he said, but his voice cracked on the word anything like he was 13 again instead of 18. Madison reached into her hoodie pocket, her movement casual and unhurried despite the tension crackling through the air around them. She pulled out her phone, the device looking innocuous in her small hands until she turned the screen toward Tyler and pressed play. Tyler's own voice filled the cafeteria, tinny through phone speakers but unmistakably clear as it emerged from Madison's recording. "Jake, I need you to plant this in her locker during third period. Make sure someone sees you but doesn't realize what you're doing. We'll discover it during the locker search, and boom! Scholarship girl becomes thief." Jake Morrison's face went white as 400 students turned to stare at him, his position near the trash can suddenly feeling less strategic and more exposed. His phone slipped from nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor as he realized Madison had been recording them for weeks. But Madison wasn't finished. She swiped to another recording, this one featuring Tyler's voice discussing his fabricated community service, with someone who sounded suspiciously like his mother. "Mom, I need you to call Habitat for Humanity again. Tell them I completed another 50 hours last weekend. And make sure they backdate the documentation to match what I already submitted to Harvard." The cafeteria erupted in chaos, students shouting questions and accusations, while teachers finally began moving toward the disturbance they'd been content to ignore when it seemed like routine bullying. But Madison's voice cut through the noise like a sword through paper, commanding attention through sheer force of will. "I have 6 hours of recordings," she announced, her phone held high enough for everyone to see. 3 weeks of documentation covering academic fraud, witness intimidation, and systematic harassment. All of it time-stamped, all of it verified, and all of it already uploaded to cloud storage where Tyler's daddy can't make it disappear. Principal Davidson finally arrived, his polished shoes clicking against cafeteria tiles as he approached the center of what looked increasingly like a revolution rather than a typical lunch period disruption. "Miss Clark, Mr. Richardson, I need both of you to step away from each other immediately." Madison lowered her phone but didn't move. Her position between Tyler and his escape routes, as strategic as it was symbolic. "Principal Davidson," she said respectfully, "I'm exercising my right to citizen's arrest under Connecticut state law. Tyler Richardson just committed assault in front of 400 witnesses, and I have evidence that he's been committing academic fraud for the past 3 years." "That's ridiculous," Principal Davidson blustered, his eyes darting between Madison's calm confidence and Tyler's obvious panic. "Miss Clark, you're clearly confused about the situation here. I'm sure this was just a misunderstanding between students." Madison's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Principal Davidson, are you familiar with Title IX requirements regarding educational institutions' obligations to investigate reports of harassment and assault?" The question hit Principal Davidson like a physical blow, his face paling as he realized Madison wasn't just another powerless student he could dismiss with administrative doublespeak. She was speaking with the precision of someone who understood legal requirements, someone who'd done her homework about institutional responsibilities that administrators preferred to ignore. "Furthermore," Madison continued, her voice carrying clearly across a cafeteria that had gone silent again, as students recognized they were witnessing history being made. "Are you aware that failing to investigate credible reports of harassment while accepting donations from the families of accused students constitutes a federal civil rights violation?" Tyler finally found his voice, desperation making him reckless in ways that intelligence should have prevented. "She's lying," he shouted, lunging toward Madison with the kind of uncontrolled aggression that marked the difference between calculated bullying and genuine panic. She can't prove any of this, but Tyler Richardson had never faced an opponent with 6 years of competitive wrestling training, had never experienced what happened when superior technique met desperate aggression. Madison's response was instantaneous and devastating, her body moving with fluid precision that made the cafeteria gasp in collective recognition of athletic excellence. She sidestepped Tyler's clumsy charge with minimal effort, her hands capturing his extended arm in a grip that looked gentle but felt like steel cables. Her left foot swept behind his right ankle, while her right hand guided his momentum past his center of balance. Physics and training combining to send Tyler Richardson crashing to the cafeteria floor with an impact that echoed through Jefferson High's carefully maintained silence. 8 seconds. That's how long it took Madison Clark to end Tyler Richardson's empire. From his desperate lunge to his complete humiliation on linoleum that had never witnessed such a comprehensive reversal of established power. Tyler lay stunned and breathless, his perfect hair finally disheveled as he stared up at Madison Clark with the dawning realization that his world had just changed forever. The cafeteria exploded in noise. 400 students cheering and gasping and shouting questions while phones captured every angle of Tyler's defeat. But Madison remained perfectly calm, standing over Jefferson High's former golden boy with the composed satisfaction of someone whose careful planning had finally reached fruition. "That," Madison said, her voice carrying clearly over the chaos surrounding them, "is what real strength looks like." Principal Davidson stood frozen, his administrative training providing no protocol for situations where the school's most privileged students found themselves flat on their backs after attacking someone they'd assumed was defenseless. Around him, teachers whispered urgently about liability and documentation, while students uploaded footage that would be trending nationally within hours. Madison knelt beside Tyler, her movement graceful despite the adrenaline that had to be coursing through her system. "Tyler," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough compassion to make her next words hurt more than pure cruelty would have. "Your father's political career depends on his reputation for family values and educational excellence. How do you think voters will react when they see footage of his son committing assault on camera?" Tyler's eyes went wide as he processed implications that extended far beyond his personal humiliation. Mayor Harrison Richardson's re-election campaign had been built on promises of youth development and school safety. His political brand would collapse overnight if video evidence showed his own son terrorizing fellow students. "You don't understand," Tyler whispered, his voice carrying the kind of broken desperation that made even his former victims feel uncomfortable. "If this gets out, it destroys everything. My family, my future, everything we've built." Madison's expression softened slightly, not with pity, but with recognition of someone who'd finally learned Tory consequences existed even for those who'd always believed themselves immune. "Tyler," she said gently, "that's exactly the point." She stood and addressed the crowd of students who'd remained frozen in place, witnesses to a transformation that would define their understanding of power for the rest of their lives. "How many of you have been hurt by Tyler Richardson?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly across the silent cafeteria. Slowly, tentatively, hands began rising throughout the dining hall. First one, then three, then dozens, as students found courage they'd never possessed, while Tyler held power over their social lives. The visual impact was devastating. A sea of raised hands representing years of accumulated suffering that had been ignored by administrators who valued donations more than student safety. "How many of you stayed silent because you thought no one would believe you?" Madison continued, her questions cutting through years of institutional enablement with surgical precision. More hands rose, some trembling with emotion, as students finally acknowledged traumas they'd buried under protective numbness. "And how many of you?" Madison's voice grew stronger, more commanding as she approached her final point. "Believed that someone like Tyler Richardson could never face real consequences for his actions." This time, nearly every hand in the cafeteria rose, a moment of collective honesty that exposed the systemic failures that had allowed Tyler's behavior to continue unchecked. Madison nodded, her expression carrying the satisfied recognition of someone whose point had been made more effectively than any speech could have accomplished. "Change starts now," she announced, her words carrying the weight of promise and threat in equal measure. Not because someone more powerful decided to intervene, but because we decided to stop accepting what we knew was wrong. And the transformation was immediate and visible. Students pulling out phones to delete old footage of Tyler's previous victims, while simultaneously uploading new videos that told a different story entirely. Social media platforms that had been used to spread humiliation were suddenly flooded with testimonials from students who'd found their voices after years of silence. Within an hour, Jefferson Justice was trending nationally. Madison's 8-second takedown, viewed millions of times as viewers across the country recognized something larger than typical high school drama. This was institutional change happening in real time. The kind of systemic transformation that usually took years compressed into a single moment of televised clarity. Harvard University's admissions office received copies of Tyler's fabricated documents before the school day ended. His acceptance letter formally rescinded by administrators who couldn't afford association with academic fraud that had been broadcast to international audiences. Mayor Richardson's office issued statements distancing the administration from actions that threatened his political survival. Throwing his own son under buses that had been privately owned until public scrutiny made sacrifice necessary. But the most significant changes happened within Jefferson High itself. Where administrators finally faced accountability, they'd avoided through decades of strategic blindness. Principal Davidson found himself explaining federal civil rights violations to Department of Education investigators who'd arrived faster than anyone thought government bureaucracy could move. Tyler Richardson himself became a cautionary tale that spread through Connecticut's educational system like wildfire, his name synonymous with the kind of privileged entitlement that institutions could no longer afford to protect. His wrestling teammates, who'd always assumed Tyler's social dominance translated to athletic superiority, learned that Madison Clark had been holding back during their brief encounters in the hallways. Jefferson High's wrestling coach offered Madison a full scholarship within days of witnessing her technique. Her refusal to compete against boys who'd never developed skills necessary to challenge her became legendary, a story that traveled through wrestling communities nationwide as evidence that excellence existed in unexpected places. 6 months later, Tyler Richardson stood before a juvenile court judge. His guilty plea to harassment charges made necessary by video evidence that no amount of family money could suppress. His sentence included community service at organizations where he'd previously fabricated volunteer hours. Irony that wasn't lost on observers who'd followed his story from cafeteria to courthouse. Madison Clark became Jefferson High's first female wrestling coach, her program developing athletes who understood that strength meant protecting rather than preying upon the vulnerable. Her teams dominated regional competitions while maintaining academic standards that shamed traditional programs, proving that excellence and integrity weren't mutually exclusive concepts. The trash can still sat in Jefferson High's cafeteria, its dented surface serving as an unofficial memorial to the day everything changed. Students would point it out to visitors, telling stories about Madison Clark's 8 seconds of courage that had transformed their school's culture more completely than years of administrative promises. But the most important change was invisible, a shift in collective understanding that made future Tyler Richardsons impossible rather than inevitable. Students learned that silence enabled abuse while speaking up created change, that systems only protected those who deserved protection when people demanded accountability from institutions that preferred comfort to justice. Madison's story spread beyond Jefferson High, beyond Connecticut's borders, to reach students who faced similar choices between submission and resistance. Her example became proof that individual courage could create systemic change, that one person's refusal to accept what everyone knew was wrong could transform entire communities. Years later, when Madison Clark graduated from Stanford Law School with a specialization in civil rights advocacy, she would return to Jefferson High as a guest speaker. The auditorium would be packed with students who'd heard stories about the girl who'd changed everything, who'd proven that real strength meant using power to protect rather than destroy. 8 seconds, she would tell them, her voice carrying the same calm confidence that had silenced a cafeteria full of witnesses years earlier. 8 seconds was all it took to prove that justice doesn't require permission from those who benefit from injustice. The applause would last longer than her takedown had. 400 students understanding that they were witnessing living proof that David really could defeat Goliath when David stopped accepting that Goliath was invincible. And in the back of the auditorium, Tyler Richardson would sit quietly, his own journey from predator to advocate still ongoing as he worked to repair damage that would take lifetimes to fully address. His presence would serve as reminder that redemption was possible for those willing to acknowledge harm they'd caused. That growth could emerge from consequence when pride finally surrendered to humility. Madison Clark's 8-second takedown had become more than viral content. It had become proof that sometimes the strongest person in the room was the one everyone had underestimated. Her story reminded audiences that every school had its Tyler Richardsons, every cafeteria had its victims, and every student had the power to choose whether they'd be bystanders or forces for change. The trash can remained, surrounded now by posters about respect, dignity, and the kind of strength that lifted people up instead of pushing them down. Because that's what happened when someone finally decided that 8 seconds of courage could change everything. That justice didn't require permission from those who'd always believed themselves above its reach. Her legacy lived in every student who refused to stay silent, in every administrator who chose accountability over convenience, in every moment when someone decided that 8 seconds of courage was worth more than a lifetime of comfortable complicity. The story continued spreading, carried by voices that had found power in Madison's example, proving that sometimes the most important victories happened not in wrestling rings or football fields, but in cafeterias where ordinary people discovered they were capable of extraordinary things. Because that's what heroes do. That's what justice looks like. And that's how 8 seconds of authentic courage can echo through generations of students who learn that real strength means using power to protect rather than destroy. The silence that had followed Tyler's fall was eventually broken, but it was replaced by something better than noise. It was replaced by voices that spoke for justice, hands that helped rather than hurt, and strength that built up rather than tore down. And Madison Clark's name became synonymous with the truth that had always existed but rarely been proven, that bullies were only as powerful as the silence that protected them. And that silence could be broken by anyone brave enough to speak. The revolution had begun with a single takedown, but it would continue as long as students remembered that 8 seconds of courage could change everything, and that everyone possessed the strength to make those 8 seconds count.